Value Impulses with Dr. Ulrich Vogel. Personnel Diagnostics Insights, Leadership, Assessments, and Personnel Development. A warm welcome. I'm Ulrich Vogel, and I'm here between the years on the Wordy Impulse podcast during this time between the years. It's a special time. I'm here with you for part 2. In part 1, I introduced the idea that these years are, well, something special, which, of course, is partly due to the calendar we've systematically developed over time. They're somewhat arbitrary, but for us they've become something familiar and represent milestones that allow for critical self-reflection on the past and a look ahead, so we can set goals accordingly. Quo Vadis society was the first part, now it's about Quo Vadis. Quo Vadis politics. And by that, I don't mean the lack of culture in the current political debates in Germany. That might be something to lament, but we don't want to stay stuck in the circle of concern, in the area of our worries or interests, but rather move into the circle of influence. What can we actually make happen? And what is it in politics, or what are political values? Political values that I might be able to highlight between the years, just to give a little impulse. First, we have to ask ourselves, what is the actual purpose of politics? What does that even mean? Of course, you can look it up. Polis, that refers to the community or common good. In ancient Greece, that's also the name for the city. And now you might say, community, that's something we already covered in part 1. That was society, but politics is different in that, while there is a connection here. To society, things like law, the economy, education, infrastructure, and so on, these are things that obviously require general regulation and therefore have to be handled differently, more institutionally, among people. And if we take a look at political philosophy, this general will is, of course, something that has often been discussed and explored. During my political science studies, I was always fascinated by this and really enjoyed it, whether you think of John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, or others. It's always about the tension between the individual and society politics, and a collective. So, what is good for the individual? What is ultimately good for the community? And then the question is, what is good? Here, of course, we're dealing with Hartmann again, who says that good is fulfilling a concept. But then the question is, which concepts do we actually need that, on the one hand, serve the individual, but also the collective, the political community, to put it that way? To serve. And maybe it's important to recognize right from the start that you can't please everyone. So, here we have to look at the interests of the individual. That's a certain maximization of benefit that's involved, which, of course, also comes from the instinct to survive, as I mentioned in the last part. But we also have dependencies from an early age in our human development. And that's why. We can't always just focus on the benefit of consumption, but as Covey nicely put it, it's not just about production, but also about production capacity. So I also have to make sure that what secures my production for tomorrow is nurtured and cared for as well. For him, the story of the golden goose is always a great example at this point. So that's the individual, who is dependent on others. And that's where we move into the collective. And there are also goods that are produced by the collective. I'll mention security here, which is a really, really important one. And of course, division of labor. It only works when there are several of us. And yes, if we want to have benefits on both sides, for the individual and the collective, then we really do have to accept some sacrifices. I think that's a truth we really need to keep in mind, that we can't always just take the sweet spot from everything. And that's why I also think it's irresponsible in politics to talk as if everything is fully covered, like with comprehensive insurance. To say, now the elections are coming and we're going to protect you. And you can keep everything just the way it is, and you don't have to do anything, you don't have to change at all. The paternalistic state will take care of it, and anyone else who wants to change something is possibly dangerous. And yes, we're going to make sure everything is great again. We're investing in infrastructure and this and that and the other thing. People often say, why are so many folks opposed to this? We could just take out loans and finance it that way. Well, I don't know if this move towards a debt-driven state isn't being thought of a bit too simply. That always reminds me of a company that goes to the bank and says, we urgently need money for investments, but beforehand, it had raised wages several times, handed out bonuses, didn't demand much, and basically spent all the money. Thank you. Of course, that's not exactly the best way to maintain your credit rating. So, we need to find a balance here. Between personal responsibility, so self-responsibility, if you will, and also taking on responsibility for others. This tension between the individual and the collective is just something we always deal with in politics. And now I've picked out 3 terms or values that I want to talk about here. The first is generating majorities. So, in a collective, in a political community, we simply have to be able to generate majorities. We have to find a balance of interests, and we have to increase the common good. And maybe just a few sentences on each of these. So, what does it mean to generate majorities? Well, generating majorities means that you say, we accept a certain. We make a directional decision and move in one direction or another. But of course, there are limits to this. I'd like to recommend again to everyone Yuval Noah Harari's latest book, Nexus, where he explains this in great detail. And we can't just suddenly decide with a 51% majority to take away the voting rights of a 5% minority of the population. Or, which I always found completely absurd, that 51% of the population in Great Britain could somehow decide to leave the EU. And what about the other 49? So it doesn't work that simply, because for certain things, in my opinion, simple majorities aren't enough. It's not decisive. In those cases, you have to protect the minority. But still, in politics, you need to build majorities. That's why you have to advocate for your opinion and engage in discussion. You also have to consider the other person's opinion, and then acknowledge and respect it. So, building majorities is important in politics, but also within companies, not just in the political community. And for that, you have to get involved, which is something a lot of people might have started to forget. The second point is to create a balance of interests. Things can't always just go in one direction. And then, if I have the majority, as I just mentioned, I could force the disadvantage onto the others. No, too. To really move forward, there have to be compromises. The willingness to compromise, which is always emphasized here, but in reality is rarely put into practice. And willingness to compromise means that sometimes the other side might get a bit more, but then things have to be balanced out again for the other party. And we're not really good at that. Even in politics, it's a bit complicated, but it's simply part of the process. And then it's about actually increasing the common good. And in Germany right now, I really see, yes, a problem, because as political communities, as states, as sovereign states here in the world, we're also in competition with each other, so internationally we're competing. And then, of course, it is also true that I can't always point to the protection of various vested interests or simply catering to the needs of certain specific groups or other similar considerations of that nature. I have to keep the much bigger picture in mind at all times. So, how can we create prosperity? So that there's actually something to distribute again. Sometimes people forget. They say the common good, you can just tap into whatever's been generated. No, the point is to increase it. So first, we have to create something, economically speaking, surpluses. And then we can distribute them accordingly. So, generating majorities, creating benefits, balancing interests, and increasing the common good. I think these are things, political values, that we should return to so that maybe in 2025 we can move forward a bit again. So, what's my conclusion here? I believe everyone can make a very positive contribution. No one can change political or social developments on their own. That just doesn't work. We can't just flip a switch. But that doesn't mean we get to complain about it. Instead, we have to start with ourselves. Self-leadership is always the very first step. We have to take a good look at ourselves first. And I really believe that, even though we can't change things on our own with the right values, again, by building majorities, balancing interests, and increasing the common good, we can help make sure that both politics and society move forward in a reasonable way. And I would really say, it would be nice if politics could remember that, because what bothers me more and more is that it's often the other person who gets disparaged and insulted. And the actual issue gets lost from view. So, instead of saying, I'm against the other person and what they're doing is unacceptable, it should be, I believe we should do it this way, and I have my reasons for that, and I try to build a majority. But I also know that certain interests need to be balanced out. And my focus is on the bigger picture, which is to promote the common good. I hope that this or that political thought might inspire you to reflect or even lead to some insights. Thank you so much for joining me during this time between the years. For my value-driven reflections, I hope we'll hear from each other again very soon. In 2025.